I'm really honored to be here in front of you today, and I'm even more honored to be introducing Dr. Julie Macfarlane, who is our keynote speaker for today. I met Julie a few years ago when she was working on her study with ISPU, and at the time I was working as a case manager at Muslim Family Services, and I had heard that there was this researcher who would like to speak to people in the Muslim community who have experienced divorce or who work with couples and individuals who have experienced divorce. And I was thrilled to know that Julie was conducting this research, and I met with her and she interviewed me. And since then, we have maintained a connection, a relationship, a friendship, and everybody that I know who has spoken with Julie can attest to her kindness and her sincerity, and really she is able to have people trust her, and she really embodies the academic researcher who is distinguished in their field, but someone who is also engaged in the community. And I think this is exactly what ISPU seeks to do as an institution. Julie also is a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor, and she has researched and written extensively on dispute resolution, and in particular the role of lawyers. She also, for those of you who are not familiar with her study, she conducted a study with ISPU for 4 years, focused on how individuals in the Muslim community navigate Sharia law as well as the civil law system when they are seeking a divorce. And she wrote a book, and the book is called Islamic Divorce in North America, Choosing a Sharia Path in a Secular Society. I'm so privileged and so honored to be introducing Julie. Julie, thank you and welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Amal, for that lovely introduction. Really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here tonight to introduce, or to, if you like, kick off the project that Amal and others are going to be working on for ISPU in the coming months, and to tell you a little bit about how the work that I did initially around divorce and marriage has built into and will be built upon in this new project. And I believe that it's going to take some of the really important questions there forward somewhat. So if I click, is this going to happen? Oh, it worked. There you go. This is actually a picture which you're going to see as you come in and out of this room, because it's featured on the poster for this new project. It's also the picture that's on the front of my book. And it's also a picture that Amal found when we were looking for a good picture to go on the front of the book. This is the book that I wrote that has been described, and I'm here just to tell you a little bit about how I came to do that work, what it found, and the, if you like, directions that it points to for the next phase of data collection and the challenges that it brings for the Muslim community. I was particularly interested when I started this project in understanding more about what at the time the newspapers in Ontario were describing in apparently very scary terms. Sharia divorce, the headline screamed. And nobody really seemed to know exactly what that meant. And as a non-Muslim, I knew amongst others who were non-Muslims that we had no sense of what that really meant. But we did know that what the media was telling us was that it was a very, very scary and frightening thing, whether or not we knew anything about it. So it seemed to me to be important to go and gather some actual information to inform myself and others what it really meant for Canadian and American Muslims when they sought some kind of religious closure and some religious sanction, if you like, for ending their marriages. And that began an odyssey that went on for 4 years and involved me in learning by immersion about Islamic family law, which was fascinating, and I was helped by many people, and also beginning to understand more about how marriage and divorce are connected within Islam because of the importance of the vows that are made in the nikah and the fact that a religious divorce is seen as the way of undoing those vows. So the men and women that I spoke to when I conducted interviews told me over and over again they needed to be able to do something that showed that they were respecting their obligations in Islam when they ended their marriages, as well as conforming with the law of the land. So I interviewed many different people in the course of this project over these 5 years, imams, scholars, social workers, therapists, and counselors in the Muslim community who work with Muslim families and community leaders. And after probably at least 12 months of working in the community, meeting people, and really trying to educate myself from a position of initial ignorance to understand more about what marriage and divorce meant in Islam, I finally began to talk to men and women who were gracious enough to describe to me their personal experiences of how they had struggled with conflicts in their marriages and how, in most of those cases, they had ended up making a decision to become divorced. And the processes that they had used, both in the legal system, but also within the community, and the steps that they took within their families to, as I said, to meet their obligations when they came to undo their nikah. This, of course, was a topic that was difficult for many people in the community to want to talk about. You know, it's not exactly an uplifting topic to talk about divorce. And in fact, part of what's going to happen this evening in describing the next phase of this project to you is, I think, a refocus on a more positive way to think about how the community deals with these challenges. But my focus in this first project was to find out more about divorce and what was really going on inside the community and how people responded to the idea of marriage conflict and marital breakdown. So I also, as well as doing a lot of interviews, more than 200 interviews, I held discussions in mosques and community centers. Sometimes not many people came. Sometimes people felt very awkward about being there. But gradually we encouraged people to talk a little bit more. And in the end, I spoke to a lot of people who were extraordinarily generous with sharing their stories with me, and who told me over and over again, and again this relates to what you're going to hear tonight, I want to tell my story of the struggle I had in my marriage and the fact that I have eventually ended up divorced because I want somebody else to learn from my story. These were all people who wanted what had happened to them to matter and to mean something for others so that they could perhaps find a different path. So there is a whole book written about this with many, many stories of many amazing men and women describing their experiences. But two principal findings I just want to point out to you this evening. The first one, which I think will be of no surprise to you in this room, is that Islamic divorce, a religious process that gives a sanction to couples when they end their marriages, remains meaningful to many, many people in the U.S. Muslim community, and that includes both secular and more observant Muslims, and that was very clear in my study. This remains a very important part of what it means to find closure, as well as obtaining a legal divorce. But another finding that I had, which was almost accidental, because this wasn't what I had initially imagined I'd be learning about, and is very relevant to tonight, is that there is very little recourse to premarital counseling or any other kind of third-party assistance with marital conflicts among Muslim communities in the United States. That there is often a real hesitation amongst people in terms of seeking help and a real difficulty finding and identifying somebody who can help them. The first question I asked in every interview that I conducted with a man or a woman who had been divorced was, when did you realize you first needed help and where did you go? And they could almost always, they answered the first part of that question easily. I first needed help at this point, I knew that we were really in trouble. Where did you go for help? I did not know where to go. Many, many people said they didn't know where to go. And one of the things that is clear from my study, focusing on divorce and the very, very bleak end of the marriage spectrum, if you like, is that most of the people who sought help sought it too late for it to really be effective in enabling them to put their marriages back together. So let me just give you a little bit more of an insight to what I found that is going to be relevant to this new project. When I began this research, this is often the way when you do qualitative research, you imagine that you're going to find X and Y, and what you end up finding is an awful lot else, A, B, C, D, E, that you weren't necessarily anticipating. I never asked anyone I interviewed to tell me why their marriages ended, but every single one of them did. Sometimes in exhaustive detail. And so I wound up with an enormous amount of data on the causes of conflict within Muslim marriages. And the first thing that I want to say to you that is really important, having done studies with other communities on divorce, is, this really isn't that different. The reasons that people struggle with it in their marital relationships in the Muslim community are the same reasons that non-Muslims and people of other faiths struggle with inside their marriages. There is an enormous similarity between the data that I've collected here and in other communities too. But let me say something specific about what jumped out from the data that I did collect here. By far the most common cause of conflict between a husband and a wife, changes in gender roles, which is a polite way of saying that the young women who are wives today are leading a very different life than the lives of their mothers and their grandmothers and the mothers before them. They are far more educated. They have expectations about becoming career professionals. They want to be part of a community in a very active way, as well as taking care of their home and their children. So there is a real shift that we're seeing throughout society. And to be perfectly frank with you, the people I talked to, some of the husbands clearly had dealt better with that shift than others had, and some were really struggling. So changes in gender roles were a struggle for many, many people, both husbands and wives, as they tried to readjust, and as they looked for role models from their own families, they realized that their lives now are often very different to the lives that their mother and father or their grandparents were leading before them. And so there was a certain amount that they just had to make up for themselves. And making it up for yourself, as our guests this evening are going to tell you, is often very difficult to do. But that is a challenge that faces many of these couples. Domestic violence. I found that 1 in 4 of the people that I interviewed who had become divorced cited domestic violence as an issue, as a factor in the breakdown of their marriage. Now, that figure, I realize, is shockingly high. But I would add immediately, it is no higher than it is in any other community. We see, unfortunately, an extremely high level of violence and partner abuse leading to divorce across communities. And so that figure is not surprising. I'm going to come back to that issue in just a moment. I saw some particular cultural issues within within the families of the men and women that I interviewed that are particular to the Muslim community. For example, I saw many instances where there was a role envisaged for the extended family, for the in-laws, that didn't necessarily work very well for this young couple, or perhaps worked for him and not for her, or for her and not for him. So the role of the family that is so important within Muslim tradition and culture has to start to adjust to some of the demands of the contemporary world where it won't necessarily fit as easily within modern marriages. Similarly, arranged marriages. Many of these young people who had had arranged marriages had not had much opportunity to really figure out what their shared expectations were before they became a couple. They felt tremendous responsibility to make the marriage work because their parents had believed that this was the best thing for them to be doing. But in many ways they had been very poorly prepared for their lives together because they simply hadn't had the opportunity to spend a lot of time working on it. They'd spent much more time planning the wedding in some cases than they had planning their marriage. There were some cases as well where one couple was more observant than the other. That sometimes caused difficulties between the couple. And there were also cases where one family had a different idea of what a traditional wife or a traditional husband should do that didn't jive. So in a way that goes back to the issues around gender roles. I also saw lots of efforts at reconciliation, especially through my conversations with the imams and also from my conversations with the men and women who were eventually divorced. The practice, as obviously everybody here understands, is often very focused on families and having families intervene. And there is also a certain amount of work done among the imams to try to bring couples back together. But I want to make just one quick comment about that. There's a lot more about this in my book. Imams and uncles are not always the best qualified or skilled people to effect reconciliation between couples. They may make the very most genuine and sincere efforts to enable people to resolve their differences. But one of the things I heard over and over again from couples who did not succeed in reconciling was that the family told them to reconcile, which is not a terribly helpful thing to tell anybody. And imams told them to reconcile, rather than actually trying to work with them through the root causes of what it was that they were experiencing. And I believe these were very well-intentioned interventions, but the fact of the matter is they were not very good in producing reconciliation as an outcome. I did come across some other resources, and this is where this project will take off. Some examples of premarital counseling being taken very seriously in a few places, and also other forms of marriage counseling services. And those were the services that the people in my study either found the most effective over the long term, or as they looked back and I asked them what would have helped you in your marriage, these were the kinds of resources that they identified would have helped them. So, just to finish, why is this new project important? I was thrilled when Shireen called me and told me that they were going to move this work forward, because what I saw at the end of this project was an enormous, authentic desire within the Muslim community to continue to sustain healthy marriages within your communities. But at the same time, all kinds of challenges coming at you from all directions. The challenge of, quite simply, the rising divorce rate, because it is out there in the United States population and it is affecting the Muslim community. The challenge of change around the roles that men and women play in relationships and in marriages. The challenge of family conventions and traditions that are starting to evolve and meld into a more North American Muslim convention, further and further away from people's countries of origin. These are all huge pieces of transition for this community. And I think to be really proactive, to take charge here, you need to start to think more practically about what resources you're going to offer people who are facing difficulties in their marriages, and how you're going to try to prepare them for marriage before they commit to one another. And part of that is going to be being willing to talk about this, and to talk about it openly, because it is an issue, as Shireen said at the beginning, that affects so many people. So the idea is to move on from this analysis to some really practical community-based solutions. What works, what is helpful, what supports people, what helps them in their times of crisis, what kinds of strategy are going to be effective. Is that education in terms of premarital classes or training of some kind? What forms of counseling, professional counseling, counseling within the mosques, counseling within the community from social workers, community members, and what other kinds of support are going to be helpful, so that the next time somebody does a study on divorce among Muslims in North America and they ask them the question, when did you know you needed help and where did you go? They will be able to answer not just the first part of that question, but the second part of the question as well, that they knew where they could go for help.